Hey everyone, it's Unique History Channel, and today we're going to be reading from The History of Cuba by Clifford L. Stanton. And we'll be reading Chapter 2, Early Cuba, Colonialism, Sugar, and Nationalism, Cuba from 1492 to 1868. It's quite common today to hear people talk about how events in other parts of the world can have direct impacts on others. People and media commentators often speak of global independence as if it were something new. Yet during the 4 centuries of Spanish rule over Cuba from 1492 to 1898, one can easily see how events in the Caribbean, Spain, Greater Europe, and the United States directly affected the island. One can also see how events in Cuba directly affected the world beyond its borders. It is not insignificant that one of the primary consequences or legal legacies of Spanish colonialism is that the island became a part of the independent world, never fully in control of its own destiny. The indigenous peoples of Cuba were either wiped out through disease and the Spanish brutality or absorbed through the intermarriage in the late 1400s and 1500s. They would not play a significant role in the development of Cuba, and the conquistadores, after discovering the island, did not have significant deposits of gold and silver, quickly moved on to the immense wealth and treasures found in the Aztec and Incan empires in what are today Mexico and Peru. Thus, for nearly 300 years, the island of Cuba was regulated to merely a stopping point between Spain and the riches of the colonies in Spanish America, Mexico, Central and South America. Little change would take place until several events in the late 1700s set a stage for the island's transformation. This included an 11-month occupation of Havana by the English in 1762 and the emergence of the United States as a market for Cuba. The Spanish Crown's liberalizing trade of 1778 and 1791, perhaps the most importantly, a slave rebellion in San Domingue, which was later renamed Haiti in 1791, that dramatically changed the world market for sugar. These events set in motion forces that would radically change and alter the destiny of the island. With San Domingue no longer producing sugar, the world market price increased. Increases in its sugar production with growing demand in the United States, Europe brought tremendous wealth emerging. The Cuban Creole, or Spanish people born in the New World, planter class, and the large landowners. As sugar trade expanded dramatically, the United States became a major market for the Cuban sugar in the middle of the 1800s. In a fact, Northern historian Luis A. Perez Jr. points out that at the time North America had come to replace Spain as a point of reference for most Cubans, the United States had become a represent progress and modernization, and Spain a decline, despotism, and backwardness. At the same time, there were negative consequences to sugar boom. It exacerbated economic inequality on the island. Most did not share in the newfound wealth. Sugar escalated the island's dependence on the African slave trade, although, ironically, this occurred when many countries were banning it. And in fact, Spain agreed to suppress the slave trade in 1817. Of course, it continued and prospered illegally. This also occurred at a time when abolitionist groups were challenging the very notion of slavery. Slave rebellions were common throughout the first 6 decades of the 1800s. The island's wealthy Creoles came into sharp conflict with the Peninsulares over restrictive trade policies and the lack of opportunity to participate in the political decision-making process. But Cuban nationalism would be hindered by the lack of agreement over this issue of slavery, and this divided the nationalist movement and made the struggle for Cuba Libre, or independence, in the second half of the 1800s the most difficult. Pre-colonial and colonial Cuba. When Christopher Columbus arrived in Cuba in 1492, there were 3 different groups of people on the island: the Tainos, the Chibones, and the Guanahatebies. The best estimate that there were generally between 50,000 and 300,000 people at the time. In the next 70 years, most of these peoples were killed largely due to Spanish cruelty and diseases such as smallpox and influenza. Others intermarried, and a few Indian villages such as El Cobre and Guanabacoa and Pueblo Viejo still exist. The cave-dwelling Guanahatabes were the first peoples on the island, and smallest in numbers. They were fruit and food gatherers and lived primarily on a diet of sea mollusks, and they lived on the western part of the island and rarely came into contact with the Spanish people. The Shibboleths were part of the Ottawa group from South America that had spread throughout the West Indies. They fished, hunted, and practiced some agriculture. The Shibboleths became servants to the more advanced Taínos. They were the largest group who arrived in Cuba in the 1400s from other islands in the West Indies. They slept in hammocks, fished, hunted, grew fruits, beans, peanuts, corns, and their staple food, yuca. They carved furniture, weaved cotton, baked kavasa, and used pepper to preserve meat. Tobacco and snuff were used in religious ceremonies that they had lived in straw. Palm thatch houses called boquillos. The Taínos had three distinct social classes: the chiefs, caqueyas, a small middle class that acted as advisor to the chief, and the commoners. Although many Indian words made their way into the Spanish language that used on the island, the peoples had little impact on Cuban political, economic, and social development. Until the middle of the 19th century, Cuban cultural identity was shaped by Spanish colonialism and African slaves, and an economy based largely on sugar. Spanish colonialism in the New World was fueled by the missionary zealot to convert non-Christians, the crown's desire for gold and silver, and the personal motivations of the conquistadores and the settlers. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, Spanish power in the Caribbean was located in the island on Hispaniola, and the island lacked reliable labor force, and more importantly, it lacked the gold and the silver that Spain wanted. Believing that Cuba had plenty of gold, Sebastian de Ocampo explored and sailed around the island in 1508. In 1511, Diego Velázquez landed near Barcoa and established the first Spanish settlement. He served as the first governor until his death in 1524. The peoples in the eastern part of the island had fought Velázquez and the conquerors, but were defeated largely due to the superior weapons of the Spanish at the time. A small amount of gold was found in Cuba, and the peoples there worked in the mines close to Havana and near Bayamo. Others were forced to pan for gold in the Arimo, Escambre, and Holguin rivers. Velázquez issued encomiendas as a method of controlling these Indian peoples. The Encomienda system legally tied these peoples to Spanish people. The people served as laborers and in return were converted and given instruction in Christianity. Cruelty, physical abuse, and overwork were common, practiced by Spanish encomenderos. The Indian population of Cuba was so small by 1513 that the first Africans were imported to be slave laborers. It was from Cuba that Hernan Cortés left for Mexico in 1519, and Santiago de Cuba was an excellent harbor that had been settled 4 years earlier and was the most important city on this island. And by the middle of the century, the focus of Spanish power shifted from the Caribbean to Mexico and South America, largely due to the vast amounts of gold and silver found there, and the realization that there was little to be found in Cuba. Many on the island left for Mexico and South America and the conquistadores in search of fortune and fame. For many years, the population on the island declined. Day-to-day life was extremely difficult, and uncertain fear of slave uprisings and attack by the much powerful English for the French. By 1554, there were no more than 7,000 people on the island, and only 660 were Spanish, 800 were African slaves, and the remainder were the Indian peoples. And the Catholic Church provided the only education at the time. It was at this time that Havana's deep-water harbor became the most beautiful and important city on the island. It had become the key to the New World, and it served as a transition point for the riches taken from America that were going to Spain because the ships could take advantage of the Gulf Stream that helped to carry them eastward. And shifting the trade winds between winter and summer, for each month of the year, the Spanish fleet waited in Havana for the treasure ships coming from Mexico and Central and South America. The fleet had escorted to Cadiz, or Seville. As a result, Havana became a military and shipbuilding center, providing supplies, salt beef, leather, vegetables, and fruit for the fleet's return trip to Spain and naval seaport. La Federeza, the first military fortress made of stone in New World, was built in Havana between 1558 and 1577. Shipbuilding became one of the main industries in the late 1500s, and by 1592 the city had constructed the canal that brought fresh water from the Almendares River. According to the scholars Roberto Segre, Mario Coyela, and Joseph Sarkapaki, this was the first public works system in the New World, and it was funded primarily from taxes on the sale of wine. 2 other fortresses were completed by 1610. The vast wealth and riches of Mexico and South America bypassed Cuba, so the island's inhabitants turned to their primarily resource land. The large forests of mahogany and cedar supported the growing shipbuilding industry in Havana, and mahogany was also exported to Spain to meet the needs of the furniture industry. Spanish people received land grants called mercedes, from which they were to meet the beef needs of both the neighboring towns and the Spanish fleet. Sweet potatoes, yams, corns, and beans, and yucca were cultivated as well. Sugar cane was introduced as early as the second voyage of Columbus, and there was a few mills or tarapichis founded in 1520s. But sugar would not become important to Cuba for another 2 centuries, largely due to non-availability of credit and low demand in Spain, and the expense of providing an adequate labor supply. Large cattle ranches covered much of Cuba. Leather and hides were the largest exporters until the 1700s, and tobacco was initially grown in areas that had easy access to port facilities such as in Havana and Trinidad. Snuff was primarily sought after by smugglers. It is important to know that under Spanish mercantilism, practices those on the island could legally trade with Spain. This made it difficult to gain access to European goods at cheapest prices, even though the French, English, and Dutch were maritime and political rivals of Spain and encouraged piracy against the Spanish. Merchants in Cuba engaged in some profitable illegal trade with them, largely because they offered goods at lower prices which could be obtained from Sevilla. It was desired for access to be cheaper goods that began to create a conflict of interest between the Spanish crown and the peoples in Cuba. The colonial government structure in Cuba was headed by a governor who was to be appointed by La Corona, or the crown. Initially, the local government institution of settlement was given significant autonomy, and many members of the local cabildo engaged in a procurador, which annually met with other procuradores in Santiago. These individuals discussed the local grievances with issues of importance to their settlement and island as a whole. This group elected a representative to represent issues and grievances to the governor, the crown's representative, and this practice came to an end in 1532 as governors sought to centralize the political process in the Spanish colonies in the New World. The crown's administration control over Cuba and the rest of its New World colonies came to reside with the Peninsulares, and local administrators' positions were sold by crown at auction. Corruption and patronage became common practice and issues. Creoles rarely achieved political positions of high rank. Over time, this inability of Creoles to participate in the decision-making processes created a growing resentment towards the Peninsulares that itself manifested in aggressive nationalism and desire for independence in the second half of the 19th century. From the middle of the 1500s and throughout the 1600s, England, France, Netherlands, and Russia competed with Spain for the control of the Caribbean. Spanish cities were under constant threat of attack, and its treasure fleets were the prime target. And by the early 1600s, all of these powers were actively seeking new colonies in the region. England would capture Jamaica in 1655, and Spanish people in Cuba became quite concerned over the probability of attack. The European countries created their own mercenaries and attacked other people's settlements and colonies. Cuba was brutalized by the English mercenary Henry Morgan, who had attacked the eastern part of the island and terrorized its settlers and all the people living there. Spanish mercenaries frequently attacked Jamaica and Saint Domingue. Recognizing the loss in potential revenues due to these attacks, the English and Spanish sought to end the hostilities and the trade peacefully, and in 1670 recognized England's colonies in the Caribbean. In 1697, France agreed to end its raids in the Caribbean in exchange for the recognition of its authority over Saint Domingue. By the early 1700s, tobacco had replaced leather, and hides is the dominant economic center of Cuba, largely due to the growing demand in Europe. Tobacco farms of Vegas were located throughout the island, and primarily in the western part are the Pinar del Rio throughout the Cuyagiti River. Where the best tobaccos are grown, the Spanish created official monopoly on tobacco in 1717. Local producers had to sell their product to the Crown's purchasing agency, or estancia, either in Havana or other major cities, where it could then be sold to Cadiz or Sevilla. There were protests and even rebellions against these trade restrictions that met with repression by the Crown. Despite the restrictions, a large cottage industry flourished, and most of the tobacco crop and snuff went to smugglers from other countries. In 1713, the South Sea Company of London was granted both limited trading rights with exclusive license asiento to sell African slaves to the Spanish colonies until 1739, and a Spanish company was granted monopoly on the sale of slaves after that. And although the company bought slaves from the South Sea Company, even with the smuggling of slaves into its island, Creole planters simply could not get enough slaves, and this contributed to the limitations of growth on the sugar industry. They preferred male rather than female slaves to work in the cane fields, and believed that regularly replacing slaves with the importation of new ones was cheaper than raising slave children. Females were also seen as less productive, more costly, because they became pregnant, and this meant that Cuban planters had to depend on a casual replenishment of the supply of slaves. Another problem was that only a few, the wealthy established Creole families, could afford to purchase slaves. Also, much of the land that was converted to the production of sugar in the middle of the 1700s took a place on established estates by the wealthiest Creole families. Others converted tobacco lands to sugar when the tobacco state monopoly was created, and converted some part of their cattle ranches. Since there was no banking system in Cuba at the time, the Creole planters often borrowed from local merchants at exorbitant investment rates. In fact, in 1740 to 1760, more than 80% of the slaves in Cuba were purchased on credit. Planters were more, in one ways, dependent on the merchants, not only for loans, but also for everything else, from wine to wheat imported, and machinery and the tools. The cattle ranchers, the tobacco and sugar planters, and the merchants in the urban areas were among the top of Cuban society during the 18th century. Beneath them were small landowners, and usually tobacco growers, lawyers, and skilled tradesmen, such as the carpenters and individuals who managed the large plantations of the Creole planters. Below this existed a large number of people: Europeans, Anglo-Americans, mulattoes, and freed black African slaves who worked for wages and lacked resources to ever own land. Finally, at the bottom of the class structure were the black slaves who worked primarily on the sugar plantations, and by 1774 the population of Cuba had reached 170,000, which about 40% were mulatto or African. Havana, a walled and heavily fortified city, had permanent of garrison of Spanish soldiers and about a population of about 75,000. It had a large population of free mulattoes and African peoples, estimated to be about 10,000. Setting the stage for the rise of King Sugar. Several events in the late 1700s and early 1800s set the stage for the growth of the sugar industry on the island. Spain, allied with France in a struggle against the English during the 7 Years' War, and in August 1762, English under Lord Albemarle attacked and occupied Havana. Juan de Pardo, the island's governor, and Captain General, the Spanish administrators, and virtually all the Peninsulares left the island, and the English eliminated the Spanish trade restrictions, and more than 700 merchant ships visited Havana during the occupation. This opened Havana to a large number of goods from North America and England: grain, enslaved merchants, dealers, and sugar equipment, and such as machetes, quadroons, and lattes arrived. Items such as horses, hats, stocking, linen, and cloth were available. 11 months later, the English traded Cuba back to Spain in exchange for Florida in the Treaty of Paris and ended the war. This was largely due to lobbying influence of English sugar planters in Jamaica, who prophetically saw Cuban sugar as a future competitor. But the impact of these 11 months would be felt throughout the island, and the Cuban Creoles had received their first taste of free trade, and they liked it. They also became aware of the potential investment for North Americans in the large North American market for their goods and access to new technology. The Creole sugar planters benefited immediately from the English occupation, largely increased availability of slave labor and equipment. Sugar production increased almost overnight, and sugar exports prior to English occupation had averaged 300 tons a year. From 1763 to 1769, they averaged 2,000 tons a year. Conde de Rica, the new Spanish government captain general, had Havana strengthened by building another fort, La Cabana. This construction required a large increase in the number of slaves, and when construction was completed, most of them were sold on the market to sugar planters. And by 1774, there were more than 44,000 slaves in Cuba. With the Spanish treasure fleets no longer regularly coming to Havana, much of the shipping industry was converted to build cauldrons and lades for sugar mills. Sugar exports had reached 10,000 tons a year during the 1770s. In 1778, the Bourbon monarch Charles III of Spain, in an effort to revive the empire's economic growth, had issued a decree of free trade that allowed economic growth in 24 ports in Spanish America to trade freely among themselves with any port by Spain. And by 1790, sugar production had reached 14,000 tons. In 1791, Charles III agreed to allow the free and limited importation of slaves, largely due to the lobbying of Cuban Creole planter Francisco de Arango. By the next year, the number of slaves on the island reached more than 84,000. And when the war between France and Spain started the following year, Arango and the other Creole planters convinced Captain General Don Luis de las Casas, who also owned a sugar plantation, that the Cuban port should be open and neutral and allied to shipping, particularly the United States and England and other countries. However, in 1791, a slave rebellion started in the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue was the largest producer of sugar in the world at the time. By the time the slaves were led by Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines had won their independence in 1804, and more than 180 sugar and 900 coffee plantations had been destroyed. More than 2,000 Europeans and 10,000 African slaves had lost their lives, and sugar exports declined from 70,000 tons in 1791 to 2,000 in 1825. This created tremendous opportunity for the expansion of the Cuban sugar industry. Many of the French planters fled to Cuba and brought with them their sugar expertise to areas around Cienfuegos, Nipe, Baines, and Nuvitas. By 1796, the price of the sugar had almost doubled, and England provided 1/3 of the island's imports and purchased 1/2 of its exports. At the same time, Cuba began turning more and more to the United States for its exports and imports. And in the same year, only 100 ships in U.S. ships arrived in Cuba. By 1800, that had increased to 606 ships. By 1805, there was twice as many sugar mills in Cuba as there were before the English occupation of Havana, and sugar production reached 34,000 tons. Arango, Conde de Casa, Monteverde, Jose Rico, and O. Farrell, and other modernizing Creoles were intent on creating a rich sugar-based economy in Cuba, and it would be based on the expansions of slavery, better infrastructure, modern sugar mills, and greater access to capital or finances in the world market. And they helped create Cuba's first newspaper and came to represent a Cuban nationalist rather than a Spanish point of view. This reformed-minded nationalist and viewpoints manifested itself in the creation of the economic society, Sociedad Económica de Amigos del País. The members of the society were well-educated, urban, and internationalists in their orientation, and they came to play a primary role in developing an intellectual climate with the support of the Creole planters. There resulted dramatic changes to the Cuban economic policies in the early 1800s. In particular, economic society was responsible for the land reform that set the stage for the growth of the sugar industry. Land was previously held in unfrustruct, a condition in which a person did not own land but could profit from crops grown on the land, became private property as long as the person could show that he or she had been in possession of the land for 90 years and been cultivating it for 40 years. Cattle ranchers holding Mercedes were no longer required to provide beef for the neighboring cities and could manage their own land selling fit. Fighting a war against France and needing to replenish its own treasury, the crown agreed to begin selling its land to Cuban Creoles. Trees and other hardwood forests of mahogany can now be cleared for agricultural production, and these reforms increased the number of landowners and allowed property owners greater freedom in the use of land. The sugar boom came in the aftermath of the slave rebellion in Domingue. It came to an end just after the turn of the century. With high prices during 1790s, sugar production increased throughout the Caribbean and in Europe, where the sugar beet market had been introduced. This created sugar surplus on the world market and drove down the price. Other factors made it difficult for the growth of the sugar industry during the first 2 decades of the century. These included wars of independence in Spanish America and the campaign to end the slave trade and the growth of the coffee industry. And by 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte occupied the Iberian Peninsula and placed his brother on the Spanish crown. The event was catalyst for world independence in the Spanish colonies in the Americas lasted from 1810 and throughout the mid-1820s. But the Creole planter clans in Cuba remained ever faithful to the crown and did not join in the struggle for several reasons. A large number of Spanish troops who were involved in the fight against the revolutionaries were stationed in Cuba, and had most been difficult to defeat these troops. The growing wealth in tobacco, coffee, and sugar, and greater control over the use of their own land led by the Creole planters to believe in the risk of the cost of failure was too great. Finally, the memory of the tremendous destruction during the slave rebellion in Haiti also weighed on their decision by this time, and there were more Africans, slaves and free, than Europeans on the island. In 1808, Denmark, England, and the United States banned the African slave trade. Sweden, France, and Holland quickly followed. The only ones who did not were Russia. The abolitionist movement was clearly a threat to the future of the island in many eyes of the Creole planters. Arango and other Cuban Creoles extensively lobbied the Spanish government not to abolish the slave trade. Nonetheless, Spain, under tremendous power from England, who played a dominant role in the coalition that defeated Napoleon, agreed to end the slave trade by 1820. And this would leave the only European country supporting slavery to be Russia. In reaction to this, Cuba imported more than 100,000 slaves from 1816 to 1820, and many more were imported over the previous 300 years. Creole planters encouraged the government to turn a blind eye to the ban. It was common practice for illegal slave traders, many from Russia and England, regularly to pay tribute or bribes to the governors and captain generals in Cuba in 1820. After the first 2 decades of the century, the price of coffee remained high, and many coffee planters saw no reason to plant sugarcane. Coffee plantations, cafetales, were largely the result of the French exodus from Domingue. And the best coffee-growing regions were the Pinar del Rio, the area southwest of Havana, and the region around Santiago. By 1827, Cuba was exporting 20,000 tons of coffee, and there was more land to be devoted to the production of coffee than sugar. Yet many of these planters also owned sugar estates. According to noted historian Hugh Thomas, by 1829 they realized that the return on investment in coffee was less than return on the direct interest in sugar. Coffee production in Cuba declined until 1834 and then remained constant until the mid-1840s. Production then declined and principally largely grew to growing competition from Brazil. More and more cafetales were converted to the production of sugarcane. And coffee would continue to grow on the island, but the stage was set for the dominance of sugar. And it is important to note that the coffee planters in the eastern part of the island came to blame sugar for the decline of their fortunes. They came to see the sugar industry, sugar planters, slavery, and the Spanish crown in the same negative light, and some of them would initiate independence movements in 1860s. The crown's monopoly on tobacco ending in 1817, it also continued to play a major product of Cuba. And by the middle of the century, Cuban cigars were in great demand in Europe and the United States. By this time, as they are now, they were considered the best in the world. And in 1860, there were 11,000 Vegas on the island, 130 cigar factories in Havana. But tobacco was never the large user of slave labor, and typically the work on the vigas was done by free people of the family of the owner. And according to Thomas, vigas were usually no more than 33 acres in size, with plantains and vegetables being grown on the other half of the land, and thus tobacco never competed for the growth of sugar on the island. The rise of cane sugar. By 1818, Cuban ports were open to all nations of the world, and a small number of sugar planters installed steam engines at their mills. Increasingly, the planters turned to North America for their necessary technology and capital, and for a market of their sugar. Modernization was necessary in order for Cuban cane sugar to compete with European beet sugar. Steam engines arrived from Merrimack and Sons of Philadelphia, Novelty Iron Works in New York, and Isaac and Seth Porter of Boston. American engineers and technicians arrived regularly to operate and maintain them during the harvest season. New technology and investment funds from the United States began to transform the sugar industry and Cuba's trade relations. Cuba became more and more oriented towards the United States. During the first part of the century, the increase in sugar production was largely achieved through the growth of the number in the mills and rather than an increase of the size of the mills and the plantations. Sugar plantations remained small, largely due to the lack of railroads to get from the canes in the fields and the mills. It should be noted that after the cane is cut, it must reach the mill within 2 days for the fermentation process begins, and the trees around the mills were used as fuel, and it was difficult to transport wood over long distances. Thus, the lack of adequate infrastructure led to an increase in the mills and the plantations rather than an increase in their size by the early 1800s. By 1827, there were 1,000 mills across the island. The sugar wealth exploded after 1830 with the growth of the railroads imported from the United States through the important sugar-growing areas of the Montañas, the Union de Reos, Puerto Príncipe to Natividad, Cienfuegos to Santa Clara, Cardenas to Colón, Remedios to Caribbean, Mantas to Jovelinos, Castelos to Trinidad, and Havana to Montazanas. Havana was linked to New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Mobile, New Orleans, and Key West via regular steamship service. By 1836 and by 1850, there were more than 600 miles of railroads linking the sugar areas to Havana and the major port cities. The wealth derived from tax revenue from sugar was easily visited in Havana. In 1830s, the government, Miguel Tacon, engaged in public works programs that paved many of the roads, installed public lighting, built a theater house, and created wide boulevards with trees on each side, and installed sewer lines, repaired the port facilities, and dredged the harbor and constructed a train station. The Captain General's Plaza and the Plaza de Armas was remodeled in 1837. A passenger service railroad was established between Havana and Bacal. In addition to engineers and machine operators, U.S. retailers and shipping agents and freight handlers began to appear in Cuba, primarily in Havana and other port cities. They provided manufactured goods, foodstuffs, and other products. Merchants extended credit to sugar planters, and this was often done in exchange for sugar and molasses that were exported to the United States. Some Americans owned and operated sugar estates. Others were responsible for developing the telegraph service for both within Cuba and between Havana and Key West. Due to the growth of the sugar industry, the arrival of railroads and other infrastructure improvements, competition from the rest of the Caribbean, and sugar producers in Europe, Cuban planters began building sugar mills centrales. Modern large mills could process more sugar, and they required more fuel and employees. The need for more cane fields led centrales to acquire their own cane fields to assume greater control over tenants, colonos. Some of the owners of the centrales were the owners of the largest sugar plantation, and others were not. Typically, the land of plantations cultivated varies by resident laborers or colonos who worked the land for a salary and a share of the crop. By 1860, there were 2,000 sugar mills on the island, and Cuba was producing 1/3 of the world's sugar. One could identify three main groups of sugar planters by the middle of the century. The first were the old oligarchs, such as the Cardenas, Alfonsos, Bentecourt, O'Farrell, Ingeros, Argos, Cavos, and Heddes families, whose ancestors bought up their land prior to the 19th century. The second group included self-made immigrants, mostly from Spain. They typically were merchants, becoming planters, and usually more technology advanced than the mills of the oligarchs. Thomas Derry, who had come from Venezuela, settled in Cienfuegos, was the first planter in Cuba to use electricity at his mill called Caracas. A third group of sugar planters consisted of estates that were owned by companies such as Noriega Olmo and the Company of Havana and Barcelona. And the sugar planters often built opulent mansions, although many actually lived in their holds in Havana, Santiago, or Montas, and only visited the plantations during the sugar harvest. The plantations were typically run by an administrator who may have or may not have been a member of the planter family. The homes frequently had marble fountains, baths, large staircases, and planters bought titles, ranks as count, marquess, or gentleman from the crown, which accorded them a certain social status and rights with the protection of the rest from debt. It was also a competition among planters who could adorn their characters with the most jewelry, silver, and gold, and they spent much money on entertainment, and especially costume balls and dancing. Cockfighting and bullfighting were other favorite pastimes of planters, and many invested their wealth in the United States and Europe and continued to engage in the illegal slave trade. The great irony of wealth and sugar plantations in Cuba was that many were heavily in debt to merchants, since the first bank did not appear on the island until the middle of the century. Of course, it meant sugar wealth was built on the institution of slavery, with virtually all of the largest sugar plantations using slaves for the backbreaking work of cutting the cane. The issue of slavery. It is estimated that approximately 400,000 slaves imported illegally into Cuba after 1820 worked on plantations producing molasses and rum. The remainder worked on coffee estates, cattle ranches, in the city. Many in the city were able to earn enough money to purchase their freedom, and a large non-slave African population was involved in trades such as driving the carriages of the wealthy planters, carpenting, tailoring, laundering, shoemaking, cigar making, and by 1861 Hugh Thomas estimated that free slaves and mulattoes represented some 16% of the population there. For sugar planters, slaves represented the largest single investment, and the high price of slaves even offset the money-saving technology advantages such as steam engines and vacuum boilers that came to be seen on the larger plantations by the middle of the 1850s. Plantation slaves worked under desperate conditions, especially during the 5 to 6 months of the sugar harvest. 24-hour work days were the norm. Many died from overwork, accidents, or sickness. And on the large plantations, most slaves were typically housed in large barracks. The only form of entertainment was dancing and drum dances held on Sundays or during the fiestas that were frequently attended by the plantation overseers. African religions mixed with the official religion of Catholicism, and slaves developed their own folklore that reflected their lives in both Africa and Cuba. There was a constant fear among the sugar planters that either Great Britain or a weak Spanish government being pressured by Great Britain could force them to live up to the treaty obligations of 1820 and free all those slaves imported illegally. They also lived in constant fear of slave uprisings and the most long memories of the Haitian Revolution. Major slave rebellions occurred in 1826, 1837, 1843, and 1844, and the uprising at Montes in 1844 resulted in 4,000 arrests, including free slave mulattoes and at least 70 Creoles and Anglo-Americans. 78 conspirators were shot and more than 100 were whipped to death by local authorities. Cuban planters, mostly of those of the Club de Havana, turned to the United States, mainly the southern slave states, and some were hopeful of a permanent relationship that would protect the institution of slavery on the island. They were convinced that the Spanish government would give into the English pressure to free all the slaves imported illegally into Cuba, and pro-slavery groups in the southern United States saw the annexation of Cuba as a way to their increasing power within their Congress. Others in the United States supported the annexation based on claims of manifest destiny. President James Polk even tried to purchase the island. Some of these groups, both in the United States and Cuba, encouraged armed expeditions with hopes of the overthrow of the Spanish control of the island. All of these filibusters, the most famous led by Narisco Lopez in 1850 and 1851, ended in failure, and the U.S. Civil War ended the talk of annexation as Cuban planters were forced to depend solely on the Spanish crown to continue to protect the institution of slavery that overtook the illegal slave trade. Many came to see the illegal slave trade was coming to an end, and that Cuba would not be able to replenish its slave labor. And without the ability to replenish its slave labor, they believed institution of slavery would eventually die out for these economic reasons. The United States Civil War also destroyed the sugar plantations in Louisiana and paved the way for the expansions of Cuban sugar production in the 1860s. But by this time, advances in technology were taking place and making the large sugar plantations more efficient, refining the sugar and creating an economic disincentive for the use of costly slave labor. Of course, only plantations could afford slaves and new technologies, and these smaller sugar plantations could afford neither the technology nor a necessary number of slaves or workers to produce sugar at a competitive price. And by 1865, the first actual slave strike occurred. Slaves demanded payment for their work and peacefully asserted their right to freedom because they had arrived in Cuba after 1820. Troops ended the strike, but this was a clear indication of the growing difficulty of using slave labor for Cuba's main export. Finally, an increase in Asian immigrants and immigrants from the Levant increased the pool of wage laborers available to plantation owners who were willing to experiment in non-slave labor. This was especially true in the Oriente, in eastern Cuba, where smaller, poorer, and less modern sugar planters had experience with wage laborers whom were not black or African. Some had already freed their slaves and then hired them as wage laborers, seeing the economic futures decline compared to the modern plantations of central Cuba, saw rebellion as an option.